There are movies that entertain, and then there are movies that become a part of people's lives. Super Troopers is firmly in the second category. Released in 2002 with almost no fanfare, little studio support, and a cast that nobody in Hollywood recognized, the strange, absurd, deeply committed comedy about a group of bumbling Vermont highway patrolmen somehow crawled its way into the cultural bloodstream and never left. Fans have watched it dozens of times. They quote it at dinner tables, at parties, during long drives, in the middle of completely unrelated conversations. The meow scene alone has been recited
if you think you know this film, think again.
So many living rooms that it has essentially achieved a kind of immortality. But here's the thing that most people do not realize. As well as they think they know this movie, there's an entire layer of secrets, backstory, and hidden truths running beneath every scene that most fans have never heard. The story of how Super Troopers actually got made is wilder, stranger, and more improbable than anything that appears on screen. And once you know what really happened, you will never watch it quite the same way again. Start at the very beginning, because the beginning is where everything reveals itself. That iconic opening sequence, the one where three college kids in a car completely spiral into panic the moment they spot a police cruiser on the highway, did not come from anyone's imagination. It did not emerge from a writing session or a late-night brainstorm. It happened. Members of the Broken Lizard comedy group found themselves in an eerily similar situation during a road trip that took place years before anyone ever thought about making a movie. When law enforcement appeared on the road behind them, rational thinking evaporated instantly. Someone in the vehicle made the frantic, desperate decision to consume everything they had on them, and what followed was a cascade of paranoia, confusion, and memory gaps that the group never forgot. The sheer absurdity of what they went through stuck with them for years, hovering somewhere between traumatic and hilarious depending on how much time had passed since it happened. When they finally sat down to write Super Troopers, they did not have to invent the opening. They just had to remember it. That lived authenticity gave the scene an energy that audiences instinctively recognized even without knowing the backstory. It felt real because it was real, and that is precisely why it hooks viewers from the very first frame and never lets go. Before any of it could be filmed, before a single frame was captured or a costume was fitted, someone had to be willing to pay for the whole thing. And that is where the story gets genuinely remarkable. Broken Lizard shopped their script around Hollywood with the kind of persistence that creative people develop when they truly believe in something. Studio after studio passed. The concept was considered too risky. The cast was completely unknown. There was no guaranteed return on investment, no bankable star to put on a poster, and no reason for any rational executive to write a check. The project seemed like it was going to disappear quietly, which is the fate of most independent films that cannot find a home in the system. Then a single private investor changed the entire trajectory of everything. This person believed in what Broken Lizard was trying to do, saw something in the script and in the group that the studios had missed entirely, and agreed to fund the whole production himself. It was an enormous gamble by any measure. Millions of dollars into a comedy with no stars and no distribution deal and no safety net. But what came with that investment was something even more valuable than money. It was total creative freedom. Nobody was looking over their shoulders. Nobody was demanding changes to make the script safer or more commercial. Every strange idea, every boundary-pushing gag, every joke that a committee of executives would have flagged as problematic stayed in exactly as written. Without that one person's leap of faith, the version of Super Troopers that audiences fell in love with would simply not exist. What audiences consistently underestimate about this film is how much painstaking, exhausting, obsessive work went into making it feel effortless. People assume it was loosely improvised, that a bunch of funny friends got together and riffed their way through production, and the cameras caught whatever happened to be funny that day. The reality is almost exactly the opposite. Broken Lizard rewrote the screenplay more than 20 times before a single camera rolled. Not tweaked it, not polished a few lines here and there, but fundamentally rewrote it over and over again with a specific, almost mathematical goal in mind. They wanted to maximize laughs per minute. They analyzed timing the way engineers analyze systems. They restructured scenes, moved jokes around, cut anything that did not land at the precise moment it needed to land. The process was relentless and often heated, because these were people who cared deeply about comedy and understood that rhythm is everything. A joke that comes half a second too late is not funny. A scene that runs 30 seconds longer than it should bleeds momentum in ways that can undermine everything around it. They understood this instinctively, and they refused to leave any of it to chance. The result is a film that holds up on repeat viewings in a way that truly improvised comedies rarely do, because every single beat was placed with absolute intent. During the period when studios were still expressing interest, before Broken Lizard found a private investor, Hollywood's attention came wrapped in conditions that would have fundamentally changed what the movie was. Executives could see potential in the script. What they could not see was a group of unknown comedians carrying a feature film on their own. The demand was consistent across every conversation they had with the industry. Bring in a famous actor to lead the cast or walk away from the table. The studios wanted a proven box office name attached, someone whose presence alone would reduce the financial risk enough to justify cutting a check. For Broken Lizard, this was an impossible ask. Accepting would have meant stepping aside from their own creation, watching someone else become the face of a story they had lived and written and rewritten 20 times. It would have meant losing the chemistry that had developed through years of friendship and collaboration, something that cannot be manufactured around a hired star no matter how talented that star might be. So they walked away. They chose creative integrity over access, and the film sat in uncertainty for a period that must have felt genuinely frightening to people who had invested so much of themselves into a project with no guarantee of ever being seen. That stubbornness preserved everything that makes the movie work. The chemistry on screen is real because the people creating it had fought for the right to be there together. While production was underway and the cast was moving through Vermont in full uniform every day, something unexpected started happening. When they stepped outside in their trooper gear between takes, people believed them. Completely and without question, local residents looked at these comedians dressed as highway patrolmen and saw actual law enforcement officers. And instead of correcting the mistake, Broken Lizard leaned into it with the same enthusiasm they brought to everything else. They directed traffic. They pulled over friends as elaborate pranks. They drove around like they genuinely owned every road they traveled. The line between performance and reality became genuinely blurry during those weeks of filming. Local communities had no idea they were watching comedians goof off in costume. They thought officers were patrolling their area, and they behaved accordingly. The crew walked a genuinely precarious line during these moments, because one serious misstep could have created legal complications significant enough to derail the entire production. But the reckless energy that came from those off-camera adventures also fed directly into performances on screen, giving the troopers an ease and authenticity in their roles that is hard to teach and impossible to fake. Not everyone who ended up in the film was part of the original plan, and nobody was less expected than Brian Cox, the classically trained Scottish actor, a performer with a reputation built on intense, serious dramatic work in theater and film, heard about the Super Troopers project and actively pursued a role. He was not approached. He was not cast through a conventional audition process. He wanted in, and he made that desire known directly. Cox had reached a point where serious roles felt limiting, where the weight of prestige performance had become its own kind of constraint, and he craved a chance to do something completely different, something that would allow him to lean into absurdity without apology. Broken Lizard was caught entirely off guard. A performer of his caliber, wanting anything to do with their scrappy, low-budget, irreverent comedy about highway patrolmen, was not something they had imagined as a possibility. But Cox was enthusiastic and committed, and impossible to ignore, so he became Captain O'Hagan. What he brought to the role transformed it entirely. He delivered the most ridiculous lines with the same intensity and conviction he would bring to Shakespeare, and that contrast between his enormous talent and the lowbrow material around him made every single scene he appeared insignificantly funnier. He also showed the younger cast members what real professionalism looks like on a set, which is a lesson that cannot be taught, but can absolutely be absorbed by watching someone operate at that level every day. There are moments in movies that audiences remember as being particularly committed, and the maple syrup scene in Super Troopers is one of those moments. What looks like a disgusting sight gag is actually a deeply committed act of physical endurance, because the production tried substitutes and none of them worked. The viscosity was wrong. The color was slightly off. The camera picked up every flaw in every alternative they attempted, because film cameras are merciless when it comes to texture and light. So they used real maple syrup, And then they shot take after take after take of actors actually drinking it in significant quantities. The physical consequences were immediate and unpleasant. Nausea arrived quickly. Sugar crashes followed. The discomfort between setups was genuine and visible to anyone watching closely. But Broken Lizard was not interested in shortcuts when the practical solution existed right in front of them, even if that solution was genuinely hard on the human body. If the gag was going to work, it needed to look absolutely real. And the only way to make it look absolutely real was to actually do it. That commitment to authenticity ran through the entire production like a thread, connecting every decision back to the same basic principle. If you're going to do something, actually do it. Casting the female lead opened up an opportunity for the kind of audition that changes the temperature of an entire room. Broken Lizard expected polished performances from actresses trying out for the part of Ursula, the kind of technically proficient readings that demonstrate range in training and careful professional preparation. What Marissa Coughlan delivered instead was something that nobody in that room was prepared for. She walked in and did something fearless, unpredictable, and borderline unhinged. She took risks that most performers would never attempt in a professional setting where first impressions carry so much weight, where the temptation to play it safe is overwhelming, because play it safe feels like the rational strategy for landing a job. But Coughlan did not play it safe. She matched the energy that Broken Lizard had spent years cultivating and went to strange places without hesitation, and that willingness to be genuinely weird secured the role before the reading was even finished. The group valued comedic instinct over traditional polish, and she demonstrated more genuine instinct in that audition than anyone else who came through the door. The character of Ursula works as well as she does throughout the film largely because the person playing her proved from the very first moment that she belonged in this particular world. Among the many things that contributed to the film's atmosphere of loose, anarchic energy, perhaps the least discussed involves the state of certain cast members during filming. Some people on that set were not entirely sober during the shooting of certain scenes. It was not planned, it was not widespread, and it was not something anyone associated with production has ever promoted or encouraged as an approach to filmmaking. But it happened, and it happened more than once. Some of the reactions that audiences interpreted as brilliantly calibrated comedic timing were something considerably less controlled occurring in real time directly in front of the camera. The hazy, disconnected quality in certain moments was not entirely manufactured through acting technique. There was an authenticity to some of those performances that came from places beyond craft, and that unpredictable element contributed to the feeling that this movie exists slightly outside the normal boundaries of how films are supposed to feel. The filmmakers have acknowledged this aspect of production honestly, without glorifying it, because the complicated truth of how something gets made is often part of what gives a final product its particular character. On a more practical level, filling out the world of film required solving the problem that every low-budget production faces, which is that background performers cost money that is not always available. Broken Lizard's solution was to call their friends. Specifically, they reached out to people from their days at Colgate University, and those people drove out to the set and populated the diner scenes, the bar moments, the crowd shots, and every other moment requiring recognizable human beings in the background. The result was something that went beyond budget efficiency. These were not strangers awkwardly hitting marks while trying to look natural. These were actual friends genuinely having fun together in a setting that happened to have cameras pointed at it. The chemistry was real because the relationships were real, and that warmth translated directly onto the screen in ways that audiences felt without being able to identify the source. Keeping trusted friends nearby also maintained morale through the long shooting days that can drain the life out of any production if the atmosphere turns unfamiliar or tense. Having your college friends around changes the energy of a set in fundamental ways, and that change is visible in the final film. Among the visual elements that define specific characters, one deserves particular attention because it was hiding a secret the entire time. Farva's mustache, that thick and ridiculous strip of facial hair that perfectly captured everything obnoxious and absurd about the character, was not real. Kevin Heffernan could not grow facial hair that matched what the character required, so the makeup department fabricated a prosthetic and applied it carefully before every single scene. This required patience and precision and considerable attention to continuity. particularly during long shooting days when sweat and movement threatened to loosen the adhesive and ruin takes that had taken significant time and effort to set up. The mustache became so completely associated with the character that it never occurred to viewers to question its authenticity. It looked right, it moved correctly, and it served the character so perfectly that nobody in the audience ever suspected they were watching a carefully applied cosmetic solution to an unexpected production problem. That fake strip of hair helped define one of comedy's most memorably irritating characters, and it remained one of production's best-kept secrets for years after the film was released. Not every collaboration that Broken Lizard pursued internally was received with unanimous enthusiasm. When the question of including Jim Gaffigan in the film arose, it met resistance from at least one member of the group who was not comfortable bringing an outsider into the tight-knit ensemble they had built over years of friendship and creative partnership. The concern was genuine and not entirely unreasonable. Chemistry in comedic ensembles is fragile, and introducing someone new, even someone talented, creates friction that can disrupt dynamics that took years to develop. The resistant cast member worried about the effect on the group's established rhythm and did not want to take a risk that might not pay off. Ultimately, the cameo happened anyway, and Gaffigan delivered something the scene genuinely needed, a moment that became a fan favorite and gets quoted with the same frequency as much of the material surrounding it. The initial resistance dissolved once the results were visible on screen. It is a reminder that protectiveness over creative chemistry is understandable, but can occasionally stand in the way of something great, and knowing when to step aside is just as important as knowing when to fight for your position. Within the film's most beloved scenes, one stands apart in terms of how it came to exist. The shenanigans sequence, the escalating confrontation that builds to one of the movie's most satisfying comedic payoffs, was written in a single pass and never changed. Not revised, not tightened, not restructured through any of the 20-plus rounds of rewrites that reshaped everything around it. It arrived fully formed and stayed that way from the first draft of the final cut. This almost never happens in comedy filmmaking, where timing is analyzed so obsessively that individual words get swapped out based on their phonetic rhythm. The cast recognized during rehearsals that what they were working with was something unusual, a scene that had arrived perfectly calibrated without needing any of the usual adjustment. The escalating back and forth built toward its conclusion exactly as it needed to, and touching it felt wrong to everyone involved. Catching lightning in a bottle like that is rare in any creative endeavor, and rarest of all in comedy, where the margin between landing and not landing a joke is so thin that writers will reshape material endlessly in search of those extra milliseconds of rhythm. That untouched scene became one of the most quoted moments in the entire film. The decision to cast Kevin Heffernan's actual parents in a scene where his character verbally abuses them was the kind of idea that sounds funnier in concept than it feels in execution. Heffernan had to stand in front of his real mother and father and deliver genuinely cruel lines at them, watching their reactions across multiple takes while cast and crew stood nearby. Even within the context of scripted comedy, even with everyone present understanding that the words being spoken were fictional and performed, the experience carried a discomfort that did not disappear simply because cameras were rolling. Repeating those insults take after take tested everyone's composure in ways that nobody had fully anticipated when the casting decision was made. His parents were generous about the whole thing, understanding that comedy sometimes demands uncomfortable contributions from the people closest to its creators. But the genuine tension that the situation produced is precisely what makes the scene work as well as it does. The awkwardness on screen is not entirely manufactured, and audiences feel that even without understanding its source, everything about the film's comedy feels natural and spontaneous, which is a remarkable achievement considering that almost none of it was improvised. The loose, relaxed delivery of lines that audiences have memorized and repeated for decades was a result of intense preparation, not freedom. Broken Lizard understood something fundamental about perceived spontaneity. It requires more discipline to manufacture than actual spontaneity does. They scripted jokes with careful attention to timing, calculating where laughs should land and how long silence should sit before the next line arrived. Performers memorized everything with precision, leaving minimal room for deviation during filming. What looks like one friend casually saying something funny to another friend is actually a carefully engineered sequence of sounds and pauses that was constructed through months of writing and rewriting. This discipline is why the film rewards repeated viewing. There are no soft spots, no moments where you can feel the production searching for the funny part. The funny parts were built into every moment deliberately, and that invisible architecture holds up no matter how many times you watch. Vermont as a setting was crucial to the film's identity, but Vermont as an actual filming location was a luxury production could not afford. Almost everything that appears on screen as the Green Mountain State was actually shot in New York, where tax incentives were better and distances from the production's base were shorter, and locations that convincingly resembled rural New England were available with the right camera angles and framing. Location scouts found small towns and wooded highways and diners that read as Vermont on screen without requiring the crew to travel far from where they were operating. The deception was seamless. Nobody watching questioned the geography. The shooting range sequences presented a particularly interesting solution. They were filmed in an actual prison facility, which gave those scenes an authenticity that no constructed set could have replicated at that budget level. The production found ready-made backdrops everywhere they looked and squeezed every available dollar out of what was sitting in front of them. The meow scene came extraordinarily close to not existing. Studio executives reviewing early cuts flagged it repeatedly as a problem. They did not understand why it was funny. They could not see the logic of it, and their recommendation was to cut it entirely and use that runtime for something more straightforwardly comedic. Their confusion was genuine, and from a certain analytical perspective, it is understandable. The joke does not explain itself. It does not build toward a conventional punchline. It operates through commitment and escalation and the mounting frustration of its victim, and none of those mechanisms are visible when you describe the scene in a boardroom. Broken Lizard fought for it with everything they had, arguing that the absurdity was the point and that explaining why something is funny to people who do not find it funny is an exercise in futility. Test screenings resolved the argument in the most definitive way possible. Audiences erupted. The executives had no response to that evidence, and the scene stayed in the film. Today, it is the single most quoted moment in the movie, which means that an entire generation of comedy fans nearly lost it because of a decision made in a conference room by people who preferred jokes they could explain. Hidden within the supporting cast is a figure who deserves more recognition than she typically receives in discussions of the film. Linda Carter, the actress who defined Wonder Woman for an entire generation to the classic 1970s television series, appears in Super Troopers as Governor Jessamine. Her presence was not marketed during the film's release and went unnoticed by most viewers, functioning as a genuine Easter egg for people paying close enough attention. Her casting added a layer of nostalgic depth that rewarded older audiences who recognized her while remaining invisible to those who did not. It is a kind of hidden detail that cult films accumulate over years of devoted viewership. Small surprises that dedicated fans discover and share with each other, creating another layer of connection between the audience and a film they already feel ownership over. Getting the film sold at Sundance required more than quality. It required strategy that was sophisticated enough to create advantages where none naturally existed. Broken Lizard arrived at the festival as complete unknowns, competing against established filmmakers who had industry relationships, critical attention, and built-in buzz. They needed something that had nothing to do with the film itself, and what they engineered was the perception of demand. They created the impression that multiple distributors were already circling the project with serious interest, positioning themselves as a hot commodity rather than desperate sellers. The manufactured buzz triggered real competitive anxiety among buyers, and a bidding war developed that was fueled partly by genuine enthusiasm and partly by the fear of watching a competitor walk away with something valuable. Fox Searchlight ultimately acquired the rights, paying significantly more than they would have without the artificial pressure Broken Lizard had created through careful management of appearances and information. It was aggressive, strategic, and entirely necessary for survival. The version of the ending that audiences know was not the one originally filmed. An alternate conclusion existed that took the characters somewhere tonally different from everything preceding it, and it did not work. Test screenings produced immediate and clear feedback. Audiences who had been engaged throughout the previous 90 minutes of carefully constructed comedy felt the shift and responded poorly to it. The filmmakers did not defend their original vision when confronted with that evidence. They listened, acknowledged the problem, went back, and built a new ending that matched the energy and sensibility of everything that came before it. The replacement landed well, and sent viewers out satisfied. The lesson embedded in that process is one that creative people often resist learning. Not every choice you make deserves to survive, and the ability to recognize when something is not working and change without ego is just as valuable as the ability to create something in the first place. Before Super Troopers 2 became reality, a completely different kind of follow-up was seriously considered. The original sequel concept was actually a prequel, set decades earlier, exploring the origins of the Vermont Highway Patrol in a different era entirely. Period costumes, vintage vehicles, a retro comedic sensibility. The idea had surface appeal, but audiences did not want origin stories and period pieces. They wanted to see these specific actors playing these specific characters again in the present, and the logistical complexity of period filmmaking created budget problems that a scrappy comedy could not absorb. The prequel concept was shelved, and eventually the straightforward sequel that fans have been requesting for over a decade was made instead.